Few names in American history evoke as much fear and fascination as Charles Manson. To many, he became a symbol of evil itself, a man who orchestrated some of the most shocking crimes of the 20th century without ever lifting the knife himself. His ability to manipulate and control others set him apart, turning him into the face of cult terror and a grim reminder of how charisma can be weaponized. Yet the road that led him there did not begin with murder. It began with neglect, instability, and a lifetime of being cast aside. His story is not only one of crime but of a boy failed by the systems meant to protect him, a young man hardened by abuse, and an adult who channeled his rage into control over others. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, like, and drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and who you want me to cover next. Your support helps keep these deep dive stories coming. Charles Manson was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was just 16 when she gave birth. She was unprepared for motherhood, rebellious, and often reckless, struggling with alcohol and unstable relationships. His father, Colonel Walker Scott, abandoned Kathleen before Manson was even born, leaving her to navigate parenthood alone. From the very start, Charles's life was marked by instability. Unlike many children who find comfort in the embrace of parents, Charles grew up in an environment where care and structure were often absent, replaced by chaos and neglect. When Charles was only 5 years old, Kathleen was arrested for armed robbery and sentenced to prison. During her incarceration, Charles was sent to live with relatives and in foster homes. Instead of providing stability, these placements reinforced his feelings of rejection. He learned quickly that he was unwanted, bouncing from one household to the next, always on the margins. When his mother was finally released, Charles hoped for reunion and love, but Kathleen remained erratic, struggling with her own demons. For the young boy, this was yet another devastating disappointment, cementing his sense of being unloved and unwanted. His behavior reflected his turmoil. By the age of 9, Charles was already stealing, skipping school, and running into trouble with the law. His first arrest came when he was caught stealing, and from there, the pattern of delinquency took root. He was sent to juvenile detention centers designed to correct and reform him, but instead, these institutions became breeding grounds for trauma. He endured abuse, bullying, and violence, which left him even more distrustful of others. More importantly, he learned survival tactics that would define his adult life: how to manipulate, how to read people's weaknesses, and how to use charm or intimidation depending on what the situation demanded. Throughout his teenage years, Manson was a revolving door resident of institutions. Burglary, auto theft, armed robbery, each offense pushed him deeper into the criminal justice system. By his early 20s, he had spent more years incarcerated than free. Prison, in an ironic way, became his home. Unlike the unpredictable outside world, prison provided a twisted sense of structure. Inside, he refined his skills in manipulation, learned how to exploit others, and began to understand the power of controlling narratives. He also immersed himself in self-education, picking up skills in music, persuasion, and philosophy, all of which would later become tools he wielded to influence others. But alongside his manipulative streak, Manson carried deep wounds of abandonment and rejection. He longed for belonging, even as he rejected the society that had rejected him first. Music became an outlet for his emotions. Inspired by the counterculture movement of the 1960s, Manson gravitated toward the growing hippie ethos of peace, love, and rebellion against mainstream values. When he was paroled in the mid-1960s, he entered a world undergoing radical transformation: the rise of the civil rights movement, anti-war protests, psychedelic experimentation, and a rejection of traditional authority. For someone like Manson, this cultural shift presented fertile ground. Though he was older than many of the young people embracing this new way of life, Manson saw an opportunity. He began gathering a following, mostly young women, by presenting himself as a guru who offered love, freedom, and enlightenment. Many of these women came from troubled or fractured backgrounds, making them particularly vulnerable to Manson's charisma. He offered them the sense of belonging he had always craved but twisted it into a system where he was at the center, dictating their thoughts, actions, and even identities. The seeds of the so-called Manson family were planted in these early interactions, long before the crimes that would make them infamous. Manson's philosophy was a mishmash of ideas borrowed and distorted from various sources: religion, science fiction, music, and his own interpretations of biblical passages. He was particularly influenced by music, believing that songs contained hidden messages meant for him. The Beatles' White Album became central to his worldview, feeding into his apocalyptic visions. While to most people these were just songs, to Manson they were prophecies, guiding his belief in an impending race war he called Helter Skelter. Yet beneath the rhetoric of peace and unity he preached to his followers, Manson's true nature was darker. His charm masked deep insecurity and rage. His ability to manipulate others was not born of wisdom but of years of practice in institutions, learning how to exploit vulnerabilities. He knew how to make people feel seen, only to twist that connection into control. He used love as a weapon, convincing his followers that devotion to him was devotion to a higher truth. And they believed him. By the late 1960s, Charles Manson was no longer just a man. To his followers, he was a prophet, a leader, and the embodiment of their rebellion against mainstream society. They lived communally, often traveling together, dropping out of conventional life, and embracing Manson's distorted worldview. What began as a countercultural experiment in love and freedom was already turning into something more sinister. Underneath the veneer of peace and enlightenment was a leader preparing his followers for violence, manipulation, and ultimate tragedy. The story of Charles Manson is not just the story of a man, it is the story of a society in upheaval, of vulnerable youth searching for belonging, and of how charisma in the wrong hands can become deadly. Part 1 of his story introduces us to the neglected child who grew into a manipulator, the young man shaped by rejection and abuse, and the emerging cult figure who would soon lead others down a dark path that shocked the world. When Charles Manson walked out of prison in 1967 after serving nearly 7 years, he was stepping into a world radically different from the one he had known before. The 1960s were in full swing, the summer of love, the hippie movement, anti-war protests, psychedelic drugs, and a growing rejection of authority. For many young people, this era was about breaking free from the rigid expectations of their parents, embracing communal living, spiritual exploration, and music as a form of revolution. For Manson, it was a perfect storm, a cultural shift that gave him the environment to reinvent himself, to cast off his past as a petty criminal and prison inmate, and to emerge as a self-styled guru. Fresh from prison, Manson seemed an unlikely candidate to lead anyone. He was 32 years old, far older than the wide-eyed teens flocking to San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district, the epicenter of the counterculture. He had no steady job, no formal education, and no resources. But he carried with him something that would prove more powerful than money or stability: a strange charisma. Years in prison had taught him how to read people, how to feed them the words they wanted to hear, and how to cloak manipulation under the guise of love and understanding. The young, disillusioned runaways he encountered were primed for his brand of charm. Manson positioned himself not as a leader in the conventional sense but as a liberator. He told his followers that society had poisoned them with lies, that their parents and the government were corrupt, and that he alone could free them from those chains. He promised unconditional love, acceptance, and a family that would never abandon them. For young people who had felt discarded or misunderstood, his words were intoxicating. They didn't see the manipulator beneath the surface. They saw a man who validated their discontent and gave them purpose. It was in San Francisco that Manson began gathering the first members of what would come to be called the family. Among them was Mary Brunner, a young librarian who fell under his spell and eventually let him and several others move into her apartment. As the group expanded, Manson's control grew stronger. He taught his followers that individuality was an illusion, that ego and possessions tied them to a corrupt society, and that true freedom came only through submission to the group, and by extension, to him. The family's lifestyle reflected the ideals of the counterculture, at least on the surface. They embraced communal living, shared everything from food to clothing, and wandered across California in a beat-up school bus painted in psychedelic colors. They experimented heavily with LSD and other hallucinogens, using the drug trips as both bonding rituals and spiritual experiences. But unlike other hippie communes of the time, Manson used drugs not simply for exploration but as a tool of control. He often took smaller doses himself, ensuring that while his followers were lost in psychedelic visions, he could manipulate their thoughts and reinforce his role as their guide. Music became another critical part of Manson's identity. He was deeply drawn to the growing rock scene of the 1960s, particularly the Beatles, whom he regarded as prophets. In his mind, their music contained secret messages meant for him alone. He began writing and performing his own songs, often gathering his followers around a campfire or in communal settings to play for them. To the family, his music was more than entertainment. It was gospel, a reflection of the philosophy he preached. And for Manson, it was a way to expand his influence beyond the family itself. In 1968, Manson's pursuit of musical success brought the family into the orbit of Hollywood. Through a chance encounter, they connected with Dennis Wilson, drummer of the Beach Boys. Wilson, drawn in by the free-loving lifestyle of the family's young women, welcomed them into his home. For months, Manson and his followers lived with Wilson, enjoying the luxuries of Hollywood while Manson worked to impress him with his songwriting. Wilson initially seemed enchanted by Manson's music and eccentric ideas, introducing him to producers and industry insiders. For Manson, this was validation, proof that his dream of becoming a famous musician was within reach. He believed fame would not only elevate him but also spread his message to the world. But while Wilson indulged Manson, the music industry ultimately dismissed him. Producers found Manson talented but erratic, too unpredictable to mold into a marketable artist. His erratic behavior and violent temper clashed with the industry's expectations. When it became clear that his chance at stardom was slipping away, Manson's frustration boiled into resentment. The rejection by Hollywood would become a pivotal turning point. To Manson, it was not merely a personal failure but evidence of the corruption and blindness of mainstream society. He began to frame the rejection as part of a larger narrative. The world was against him and his chosen family, and soon, it would collapse under the weight of its own sins. His interpretation of the Beatles' White Album fed into this worldview. Songs like Helter Skelter, Piggies, and Blackbird became, in his mind, coded messages predicting an imminent apocalypse. Manson told his followers that a race war was coming, one that would tear America apart. He called this prophecy Helter Skelter, borrowing the name from the Beatles' chaotic track. According to his twisted interpretation, black Americans would rise up against whites, killing them in violent rebellion. However, Manson insisted that black people would be unable to govern themselves afterward, leaving a power vacuum. It was then, he claimed, that the family would emerge from hiding and take control of the world, establishing a utopia under his rule. This prophecy was bizarre, paranoid, and rooted in Manson's racism, but to his drug-addled, vulnerable followers, it seemed revelatory. They accepted his apocalyptic vision, believing that their leader had access to divine insight. Manson reinforced this belief through group LSD sessions, where he would guide their trips, implanting his ideas as spiritual truths. Under the influence, the family began to see Manson not just as a man but as a messiah, capable of guiding them through the chaos to come. The family's communal lifestyle became increasingly insular and radicalized. After leaving Wilson's mansion, they settled at Spahn Ranch, an old movie set on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The ranch's decaying western town backdrop was both fitting and eerie, a stage for Manson's growing delusions of grandeur. There, away from mainstream society, the family lived under his absolute control. Daily life revolved around him, his teachings, his music, and his vision of the future. Women were expected to serve the men, particularly Manson, and to devote themselves entirely to the family. Dissent was not tolerated. Manson used a mix of love, fear, and psychological games to maintain his grip. He broke down his followers' identities, often assigning them new names, and insisted that individuality was meaningless compared to the collective. He manipulated relationships, turning people against one another or drawing them closer depending on his needs. He would tell them that he was Jesus, the devil, or both, shifting roles to suit the moment. The line between reality and delusion blurred, binding the family ever closer to his worldview. By 1969, the family numbered around 30 core members, most of them young women. They stole cars, scavenged for food, and lived in near total devotion to Manson. To outsiders, they might have looked like just another commune, one of many that dotted California in the 1960s. But beneath the surface, Manson was preparing them for violence. He told them that helter-skelter could not come about on its own, it needed to be triggered. The family, he insisted, would help spark the race war by committing murders that would be blamed on black Americans. The stage was set for the crimes that would make Charles Manson infamous. But before the bloodshed began, the family was already living in a world of paranoia, control, and delusion. What had begun as a promise of freedom had become a prison of the mind, with Manson as the jailer. His transformation from petty criminal to cult leader was complete, and his vision of helter-skelter would soon drive his followers to acts of unspeakable violence. By early 1969, Charles Manson's transformation from small-time criminal into self-styled prophet and cult leader was complete. What had begun as a ragtag commune of young runaways and drifters in San Francisco had hardened into a tightly controlled group living under his dominance at Spahn Ranch. The members of the Manson family were no longer simply hippies seeking love and freedom. They were soldiers in his apocalyptic vision, bound by fear, drugs, devotion, and a belief in Manson's prophecy of helter-skelter. The world outside Spahn Ranch, however, still looked like a thriving and chaotic America. The Vietnam War raged on, protests filled the streets, and the counterculture movement was both celebrated and vilified in equal measure. To Manson, this turmoil confirmed what he had been preaching: society was on the brink of collapse. He told his followers that they were chosen to survive and inherit the earth. And with every rejection he experienced from the music industry, every failed attempt to rise as a rock star, Manson grew more convinced that helter-skelter needed his help to begin. Life at Spahn Ranch revolved around Manson's authority. George Spahn, the nearly blind 80-year-old ranch owner, allowed the family to stay in exchange for chores and companionship, particularly from the young women. To outsiders, the family might have seemed like a quirky commune living in the ruins of an old Western film set, but to insiders, it was a place of indoctrination. Manson controlled everything: when they ate, when they slept, when they tripped on LSD, and when they listened to his endless rants about race, apocalypse, and destiny. By now, Manson was regularly framing himself as both Christ and the devil, a figure above good and evil. He claimed to have powers of insight and prophecy, and his followers, stripped of identity and high on drugs, believed him. He drilled into them that murder was not really murder, that death was an illusion, and that killing could be a spiritual act. These teachings laid the groundwork for what was to come. One key moment in early 1969 pushed Manson closer to orchestrating violence. He had been rejected by record producer Terry Melcher, the son of actress Doris Day and a figure with significant connections in Hollywood. Manson believed that Melcher could have made him famous, but instead, Melcher turned him away, unimpressed with his erratic personality and unpolished music. This rejection hit Manson hard. In his mind, it was not just a personal slight, it was proof that the establishment would never give him a platform. His dream of spreading his gospel through fame was crumbling, and his rage at Melcher became symbolic of his rage at the entire society that had dismissed him. What made this rejection particularly significant was its connection to the property at 10050 Cielo Drive. That house, in the hills of Los Angeles, had been rented by Terry Melcher and his girlfriend, actress Candice Bergen. By the summer of 1969, they had moved out, but Manson didn't realize it, or he didn't care. For him, the house remained a symbol of the Hollywood elite who had scorned him. As Manson's paranoia and frustration escalated, so did his rhetoric. He preached more and more about helter-skelter, insisting that the family would have to ignite the chaos themselves. He convinced his followers that if they killed wealthy, prominent white people in brutal ways and left behind evidence pointing to black militants, society would spiral into the race war he had foretold. This, he claimed, would fulfill the prophecy in the Beatles' music and position the family as the saviors of the New World. By August 1969, the family was primed for violence. Manson had already tested his followers' loyalty by involving them in smaller crimes, including car thefts, assaults, and even a prior murder. Gary Hinman, a music teacher connected to the family, was killed in July 1969 by members Bobby Beausoleil, Susan Atkins, and Mary Brunner. Manson himself had ordered it after Hinman refused to give them money. That killing, though less widely known, was a rehearsal of sorts, a test of whether his followers would obey him to the point of murder. They did. Then came August 8, 1969. That night, Manson summoned 4 of his most loyal followers: Charles, Tex, Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. He instructed them to go to the house at Cielo Drive, the one that had once belonged to Terry Melcher, and kill everyone inside. His orders were chillingly simple. Do it as gruesome as you can. The house at 10050 Cielo Drive was, at that moment, home to actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant with her first child. Tate's husband, director Roman Polanski, was away working in Europe, but the house was not empty. Inside were Tate's friends Jay Sebring, a celebrity hairstylist, Abigail Folger, heiress to the Folger coffee fortune, and her boyfriend, Wojciech Frykowski, a Polish writer. The group was spending a quiet evening together, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. Just after midnight, the family members arrived. Tex Watson, armed with a gun and knife, led the assault. They cut the phone lines, climbed over the fence, and quickly encountered Stephen Parent, an 18-year-old who had been visiting the property's caretaker. Parent was shot dead by Watson before he could flee. The killers then entered the main house. What followed was one of the most brutal and chaotic massacres in modern American history. The victims were tied, stabbed, and shot in a frenzy of violence. Jay Sebring was killed first, then Frykowski and Folger, who fought desperately but were overwhelmed. Sharon Tate pleaded for her life and the life of her unborn child, but her cries went unanswered. Susan Atkins later admitted to stabbing Tate, while Watson and Krenwinkel attacked her as well. In the end, Tate was dead, her baby never given a chance to live. Before leaving, Atkins smeared the word "pig" in blood on the front door, an attempt to tie the killings to Manson's narrative of a racial uprising. The next night, August 9th, Manson himself joined in directing another attack. Dissatisfied with the chaos of the first murders, he wanted to demonstrate how it should be done. He chose the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca, a wealthy couple living in Los Angeles. This time, Manson went inside with Tex Watson to tie up the victims before leaving others, Watson, Leslie Van Houten, and Patricia Krenwinkel, to finish the killings. The LaBiancas were stabbed dozens of times in another horrific scene. Again, words were written on the walls in blood: "Death to pigs," and "Helter Skelter." These 2 nights of violence shocked Los Angeles and the nation. The randomness of the victims made the crimes all the more terrifying. Sharon Tate, a rising star and beloved figure, became the face of the tragedy, and the brutality of her death horrified even a culture accustomed to headlines of war and unrest. The media quickly seized on the story, but at first, the connection between the 2 nights of killings was unclear. Police investigations were chaotic, and in the early weeks, suspicion fell on everyone from drug dealers to occultists. For Manson and the family, however, the murders had fulfilled their purpose. They believed they had struck the opening blow of Helter Skelter. The killers returned to Spahn Ranch exhilarated, convinced they had done something monumental. Manson continued to preach that the race war was imminent, even as law enforcement gradually closed in on the family for unrelated crimes like auto theft. In truth, the killings had not sparked the chaos Manson predicted. Instead, they triggered fear, outrage, and eventually, a relentless investigation that would expose the family's inner workings. But in that moment, August 1969, Charles Manson had succeeded in what he set out to do. He had transformed his twisted ideology into action, and his followers had carried it out without question. The world would never forget the names of Tate, LaBianca, or Manson. The aftermath of the Tate LaBianca murders in August 1969 was a storm of chaos, fear, and confusion. Los Angeles, already a city of contradictions where glamour mingled uneasily with crime and inequality, suddenly felt unhinged. A beloved actress, her unborn child, her friends, and a wealthy couple had been slaughtered in their homes, seemingly at random. The sheer brutality of the killings left the city paralyzed with fear. Celebrities hired bodyguards, fortified their homes, and some even fled Los Angeles altogether. The chilling reality was that if Sharon Tate could be killed in her home in the Hollywood Hills, then no one felt safe. The media quickly sensationalized the case, turning it into front-page news across the country. Headlines screamed about satanic rituals, cult activity, and drug-related violence. The randomness of the victims made speculation run wild, and reporters eagerly filled in gaps with rumor and exaggeration. The Los Angeles Times, Herald-Examiner, and other outlets covered every detail, from grisly accounts of the murder scenes to conjecture about motives. Soon, the Tate LaBianca killings were no longer just crimes. They were cultural events, symbols of the violent unraveling of the 1960s dream of peace and love. In the early weeks after the murders, however, the police investigation was disorganized and frustratingly slow. The Tate and LaBianca cases were initially handled by different divisions of the LAPD, and investigators failed to immediately connect them, despite the similarities: multiple victims, overkill stabbings, and cryptic messages written in blood. The pig, scrawled on Tate's front door, and death to pigs at the LaBianca's house seemed like obvious parallels, but law enforcement hesitated to declare a link. Instead, investigators pursued theories that would later prove dead ends. In the Tate case, police suspected drug activity. Sharon Tate's friends Wojciech Frykowski and Abigail Folger were known to use drugs recreationally, and investigators theorized that the murders might have been the result of a drug deal gone bad. Rumors spread that Frykowski was involved in trafficking narcotics, and detectives latched onto this explanation as they tried to make sense of the carnage. Meanwhile, in the LaBianca case, police suspected a robbery or random act of violence. For weeks, the public watched in horror as the murders remained unsolved, the killers still at large. This uncertainty only heightened the sense of dread in Los Angeles. Panic spread not only among Hollywood's elite but also among ordinary residents. Home security businesses boomed, and gun sales spiked. Friends turned suspicious of one another, and the idea of a shadowy cult or gang roaming the hills of LA took root in the public imagination. While police struggled to solve the high-profile cases, the Manson family continued living at Spahn Ranch, seemingly untouchable. Charles Manson reassured his followers that their crimes were justified, that they were fulfilling destiny. But beneath his confidence, there were cracks forming. Law enforcement had not yet tied the family to the murders, but they were becoming increasingly aware of the group due to other criminal activities, particularly car theft. By late summer 1969, local police and the sheriff's department were investigating Spahn Ranch as a hub for stolen vehicles. The family had been systematically stripping and reselling cars, and suspicions mounted. On August 16th, just 1 week after the Tate murders, officers raided the ranch in what became known as the Spahn Ranch Raid. While heavily armed deputies descended on the property, they were searching for evidence of auto theft, not mass murder. Manson and several family members were arrested, but due to procedural errors, the charges didn't stick, and most of them were quickly released. It would take a different crime altogether to bring the family down. Earlier that summer, in July 1969, Gary Hinman, a music teacher and acquaintance of the family, had been murdered by Bobby Beausoleil, Susan Atkins, and Mary Brunner on Manson's orders. The motive was partly financial. Manson believed Hinman had money to give the family. But the crime also carried ideological overtones, with messages written in blood at the scene. For weeks, the Hinman murder went unsolved, but in late August, police arrested Beausoleil while driving Hinman's car. Inside the vehicle, they found evidence linking him to the crime. He was charged with murder and jailed. It was this arrest that ultimately unraveled Manson's carefully constructed illusion of invincibility. In October 1969, Susan Atkins, who was also jailed in connection with the Hinman case, began bragging to fellow inmates about her involvement in the Tate murders. In a chilling display of pride, she described the killings in detail, including the fact that she had stabbed Sharon Tate. Word of her confessions reached the authorities, and detectives began piecing together what they had missed. The Tate and LaBianca murders were connected, and the trail led straight back to Charles Manson and his family. By November 1969, investigators had linked Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Linda Kasabian, and Tex Watson to the murders. Manson himself was soon implicated as the mastermind. Police raided desert hideouts where the family had relocated after the Spahn Ranch raid, arresting dozens of members. Manson, who had been trying to establish a new base in Death Valley, was captured in October after hiding in a small cabinet during a raid. The image of the wild-eyed cult leader being dragged into custody would become one of the most infamous snapshots of the era. The arrests marked a turning point in the investigation, but public reaction remained a mix of horror and disbelief. For months, the murders had seemed inexplicable, the work of random maniacs. Now, the revelation that a commune of hippies, led by a failed musician with apocalyptic visions, had carried out the killings stunned the world. Charles Manson, once a petty criminal unknown to the public, was about to become a household name, a symbol of evil and madness. The trial that followed would be among the most sensational in American history, but even before it began, the story of Manson and the family captured the cultural imagination. Reporters swarmed every development, and the narrative grew larger than the crimes themselves. Manson was not just a criminal. He was portrayed as the embodiment of the dark side of the 1960s, the corruption of the hippie dream into something monstrous. As 1969 came to a close, America was reeling. The Tate LaBianca murders had shattered the illusion of peace and love that had defined much of the decade. They symbolized a violent end to the optimism of the counterculture movement, casting a shadow over the music, art, and communal living experiments that had once seemed revolutionary. Charles Manson had succeeded, in a sense, not in sparking helter-skelter, but in etching his name into history as the man who turned youthful idealism into a nightmare. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers officially began in July 1970, nearly a year after the Tate LaBianca murders shocked Los Angeles and the world. From the outset, the proceedings were anything but ordinary. The courtroom quickly became a stage where Manson, his family members, and the legal teams performed a bizarre and unsettling drama that blurred the lines between justice and spectacle. Reporters, photographers, and curious onlookers filled the Los Angeles County Courthouse, eager to witness the trial of the man who had come to personify evil in the American imagination. Charles Manson himself was the center of attention. He entered the courtroom barefoot, dressed in long hair and flowing clothes, often staring directly at the jury with a mixture of defiance and charisma. His behavior was erratic and provocative. At times he would draw smiley faces on the walls, sing fragments of songs, or scrawl notes in the margins of legal documents. He cultivated an aura of unpredictability, a performance that blurred his true intentions. Observers were both repelled and fascinated, struggling to comprehend whether they were witnessing the theatrics of a manipulative criminal or glimpsing genuine madness. The prosecution's case against Manson and his followers was meticulous, relying heavily on eyewitness testimony and confessions obtained from family members. Linda Kasabian, who had been present during both the Tate and LaBianca murders but had refrained from directly participating in the killings, became the prosecution's star witness. She provided detailed accounts of Manson's instructions to commit the murders, the planning sessions at Spahn Ranch, and the way he manipulated his followers into executing the killings. Her testimony established a clear narrative. Manson was the mastermind, orchestrating a series of murders that would instill terror, provoke racial tension, and secure his own apocalyptic vision, which he called helter-skelter. Manson's defense attorneys faced an uphill battle. Initially, they attempted to portray him as mentally unstable, suggesting he was not in full control of his faculties during the planning and execution of the murders. Psychiatric evaluations, however, offered mixed conclusions. Some experts diagnosed Manson with antisocial personality disorder and paranoid schizophrenia, while others concluded he was cunning, calculating, and fully aware of his actions. In court, Manson's own behavior undermined the defense's credibility. He frequently taunted the judge, shouted obscenities, and refused to follow courtroom procedures, making it difficult for his attorneys to present a coherent strategy. The other defendants, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, were tried alongside Manson. Their participation in the murders varied, with Atkins and Krenwinkel actively stabbing victims while Van Houten was involved in the LaBianca murders. Each followed Manson's instructions to varying degrees, but in court, the prosecution painted all as complicit in a single, orchestrated plan. Their youth and indoctrination were key points for the defense, highlighting how Manson's charisma and manipulative tactics had ensnared them. Still, the overwhelming evidence, including physical traces, eyewitness accounts, and Kasabian's detailed testimony, left little doubt about their culpability. Media coverage of the trial was unprecedented. Reporters camped outside the courthouse, filing stories that combined detailed legal analysis with lurid descriptions of Manson's eccentric behavior. Television broadcasts brought the trial into living rooms across America, allowing the public to witness every bizarre outburst and shocking revelation. Journalists debated endlessly about whether the spectacle was informative or exploitative. Many argued that the media's attention contributed to Manson's larger-than-life persona, amplifying his influence even from behind bars. The courtroom became a theater, a public arena where justice and performance collided in ways that captivated and horrified the nation. One of the most chilling elements of the trial was Manson's attempts to manipulate the proceedings. He frequently tried to communicate coded messages to his followers, sometimes through letters or statements delivered in court. He claimed that the murders were part of a larger racial war, insisting that Black Americans would rise up and exterminate white people, leaving Manson and his followers to inherit the earth. This apocalyptic vision, dubbed Helter Skelter, became a central theme of the prosecution's argument, demonstrating that the crimes were not random acts of violence but the execution of a deliberate and disturbing plan. The trial also explored the broader social context that allowed Manson to gain control over his followers. Witnesses testified about the family's commune life, the drugs, the music, and the rigid hierarchy that Manson enforced. Psychologists explained how his manipulations preyed on the vulnerabilities of young, idealistic men and women seeking love, purpose, or escape. This aspect of the trial painted a broader picture of psychological domination and cult behavior, raising questions about the limits of free will when subjected to intense ideological and emotional coercion. As the trial progressed, Manson's courtroom antics continued to dominate media attention. He occasionally shaved his eyebrows or smeared makeup on his face, sang nonsensical songs, and refused to sit when the judge instructed him to. His unpredictable behavior, combined with his calculated manipulation of the jury, transformed him into a figure both feared and fascinated by the public. Observers debated whether Manson was truly insane, a genius manipulator, or a combination of both. These discussions went beyond the legal aspects of the trial, touching on deeper questions about evil, morality, and the nature of influence. The family members' defense strategies were intertwined with Manson's behavior. Atkins often laughed or sang during testimony, Krenwinkel alternated between defiance and remorse, and Van Houten appeared both frightened and obedient. Their youth, vulnerability, and psychological dependency on Manson were central to their defense, yet the gravity of the crimes, 7 murders, multiple stabbings, and extreme brutality, overwhelmed any sympathy the jury might have felt. The prosecution argued convincingly that, while Manson manipulated them, the murders were deliberate, premeditated, and morally reprehensible acts. By the time closing arguments arrived in 1971, the courtroom had become an arena where the American public grappled with broader cultural anxieties. The trial symbolized more than criminal justice. It represented the collapse of the idealized 1960s counterculture. The peace and love ethos, long celebrated in music, film, and youth movements, seemed perverted into something grotesque by Manson's influence. The spectacle of the trial, the media coverage, and the public fascination transformed Manson into a symbol of the darker side of human nature, a living embodiment of chaos and malevolence. When the jury retired to deliberate, they faced a task of immense weight: to determine not only the guilt of the defendants, but also the moral responsibility of a man who had orchestrated such violence from behind the scenes. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the narrative of manipulation convincing. Ultimately, the verdicts reflected the gravity of the crimes and the societal need to assign accountability. Charles Manson and the three key family members, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten, were found guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including murder committed during the commission of robbery and, in the case of Manson, as the leader of a conspiracy. The sentencing phase was equally dramatic. California had recently reinstated the death penalty, and prosecutors sought execution for the defendants. Manson, defiant to the end, proclaimed that the jury could not touch him, that he would rise again, and that helter-skelter was inevitable. Despite his claims, he was sentenced to death, along with Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten. Their sentences were later commuted to life imprisonment after California temporarily abolished the death penalty in 1972. The trial of Charles Manson and the family left an indelible mark on American society. It challenged assumptions about criminality, gender, psychological manipulation, and the capacity for human violence. Manson himself became a cultural phenomenon, his image appearing on magazine covers, in documentaries, and later in countless books and films. The public fascination was fueled by his charisma, the grotesque nature of the crimes, and the trial's media circus. Yet beneath the sensationalism, the trial also illuminated the mechanics of power, influence, and psychological control, offering chilling insights into how a single individual could bend others to commit unimaginable acts. In the years that followed, the trial would be studied not only as a legal case but also as a cultural touchstone. It revealed the vulnerabilities of youth, the dangers of charismatic leaders, and the potential for ideology to be twisted into violence. Psychologists, criminologists, and sociologists examined the Manson case to understand how cults form, how obedience can lead to murder, and how the media amplifies fear and fascination. The proceedings became a cautionary tale about the intersection of personality, circumstance. After the trial, Charles Manson was sentenced to life imprisonment, along with key members of the Manson family. Although he had escaped the death penalty due to California's temporary abolition of capital punishment in 1972, his confinement would not diminish his notoriety. Manson's time behind bars offered a continuation of the public fascination with him, extending the cultural, psychological, and criminal legacy that had begun with the murders. Even in prison, he maintained a presence in the media, wrote letters and music, and continued to cultivate the image of a figure both malevolent and magnetic, ensuring that his story remained alive in the public consciousness. From the beginning of his incarceration, Manson's behavior in prison was erratic and provocative, echoing the patterns he had displayed during his trial. He was known to confront guards and fellow inmates with outbursts, strange gestures, and cryptic statements. He often attempted to assert influence over those around him, claiming prophetic insight and moral authority. Reports suggest that he corresponded with followers on the outside, maintaining a sense of connection to the world he had once manipulated. Letters and interviews indicated that he still believed in the inevitability of helter-skelter, and he occasionally attempted to frame his crimes within a moral or philosophical context, describing himself as a catalyst for societal change, even if that change required violence. Manson also sought to leave an artistic and cultural mark. He continued writing music and lyrics, often reflecting on his worldview, his followers, and his self-perceived role in history. Songs like "Look at Your Game, Girl," and other compositions were recorded by various artists, sometimes causing public outrage. The idea that a convicted murderer could profit from or influence culture through music sparked debates about morality, exploitation, and the limits of free expression. Some critics argued that allowing Manson to retain even a partial platform was unethical, while others framed it as an uncomfortable but necessary acknowledgement of his historical and cultural impact. While incarcerated, Manson engaged with the media intermittently, giving interviews that ranged from rambling and incoherent to chillingly lucid. He frequently emphasized his ability to manipulate and control, reinforcing the notion that his charisma had not entirely diminished. He claimed to have no remorse for some of his actions, framing the murders as part of a divine or historical plan. These interviews reinforced the public perception of Manson as a figure who embodied pure malevolence, yet they also provided insights into his psychology, demonstrating how narcissism, delusion, and ideology can intertwine in a destructive way. Manson's presence in prison was not entirely without incident. He was involved in altercations, disciplinary hearings, and occasional transfers between facilities. Despite being confined, his name and reputation continued to influence other inmates and the broader cultural landscape. Reports surfaced that some prisoners admired him as a kind of anti-establishment figure, a criminal whose audacity and manipulation had changed history. Others despised him for the extreme violence he represented. Manson's life behind bars reflected the enduring power of his persona. Even stripped of freedom, he could provoke fear, fascination, and moral debate. Culturally, Manson became a symbol far beyond the confines of prison walls. His image appeared in films, books, documentaries, and music, often embodying the dark side of human nature. Documentaries like Manson and books such as Helter Skelter by Vincent Bugliosi chronicled his crimes in detail, but they also explored the psychology of manipulation and the vulnerabilities of those drawn into his orbit. The fascination with Manson extended to true crime enthusiasts, psychologists, sociologists, and artists who sought to understand, document, or reinterpret his story. He became more than a criminal. He became a cultural touchstone representing charisma, evil, and societal anxieties about control and morality. The evolution of his cultural presence also prompted ethical debates. Some argued that media coverage and artistic portrayals risked glamorizing Manson, turning him into a mythic figure whose notoriety overshadowed the victims' stories. Others maintained that analyzing his life and actions provided essential lessons about human psychology, societal vulnerabilities, and the consequences of unchecked charisma. Scholars studied his influence on cults, his ability to manipulate young followers, and the social dynamics of fear and devotion, often using his story to illuminate broader patterns of human behavior and group psychology. Manson's influence also extended to the subcultures of the 1970s and beyond. Punk rock, underground art, and other countercultural movements sometimes invoked his image, lyrics, or philosophy, often as a provocative statement rather than an endorsement of violence. This phenomenon reflected society's broader fascination with transgression, rebellion, and the archetype of the mad prophet. Manson's name became shorthand for extreme charisma and moral corruption, a figure whose existence challenged assumptions about innocence, morality, and the limits of influence. Despite this cultural attention, the human toll of Manson's crimes remained a central consideration. The families of victims, survivors, and society at large grappled with the violence he orchestrated, the lives destroyed, and the psychological scars left behind. True crime scholarship frequently emphasized the victims' stories to counterbalance the fascination with Manson himself. By doing so, analysts highlighted the ethical responsibility of culture and media. The study of a criminal's psychology should not eclipse the humanity of those affected by their actions. Manson's prison years were marked by periodic appeals and legal maneuvers. Over the decades, he filed numerous petitions for parole and reviewed aspects of his trial, all of which were denied. Legal scholars observed that his case set precedents in the application of conspiracy laws, cult-related liability, and the use of media in high-profile trials. His persistence in the legal system reflected both a desire for control and the enduring nature of his notoriety. Even in denial and defiance, Manson remained a figure whose life forced society to confront the complex intersections of crime, punishment, and public perception. In the 1980s and 1990s, Manson's influence persisted through media portrayals and public fascination. Movies, television specials, and books revisited his story, often highlighting his manipulative genius and psychological control over his followers. Psychologists and criminologists continued to cite Manson in studies of coercion, obedience, and cult dynamics. The case became a staple of criminal psychology education, illustrating extreme forms of charismatic leadership, social isolation, and the psychological mechanisms that can lead ordinary people to commit horrific acts. In 2017, Charles Manson died in prison at the age of 83, ending a life that had captivated and horrified generations. His death prompted a renewed wave of media attention, reflecting on both the crimes themselves and the legacy he left behind. Analysts debated whether his passing closed a chapter in American criminal history or merely transformed him into a symbolic figure of malevolence and cultural obsession. Even in death, Manson's story continued to provoke reflection on human behavior, the power of ideology, and the fragility of moral and social norms. The enduring fascination with Manson demonstrates society's complex relationship with evil, charisma, and the consequences of psychological manipulation. His life, crimes, and continued influence invite examination of larger issues: the vulnerabilities of youth, the impact of culture and music, the role of media in shaping public perception, and the ethics of representing crime in art and scholarship. By studying Manson, one gains insight not only into one man's destructive genius but also into the broader societal and psychological forces that allowed him to exert influence and inspire terror. Charles Manson's story serves as a cautionary tale about the power of ideology, the allure of charismatic authority, and the consequences of ignoring the warning signs of manipulation and coercion. It challenges individuals and society to question the limits of influence, the responsibilities of media and culture, and the ethical considerations of studying and portraying human evil. In examining his life, we confront uncomfortable truths about human susceptibility, the nature of leadership, and the thin line between fascination and obsession. Even decades after his death, Manson remains a figure of public fascination, a symbol of both human cruelty and the enduring complexity of psychological control. He serves as a reminder that evil can manifest in unexpected forms, that charismatic figures can manipulate and corrupt, and that society must remain vigilant in protecting vulnerable individuals from coercion and exploitation. The lessons of his life continue to resonate, challenging future generations to reflect critically on the intersections of crime, culture, and morality. The story of Charles Manson is not just a historical account of violence. It is an enduring study of human. Even decades after his death, Charles Manson remains a symbol of human fascination with evil, charisma, and the consequences of manipulation. While his crimes were rooted in a specific historical moment, the late 1960s counterculture and the rise of youth movements in California, his influence has transcended that era, evolving into a cultural and psychological touchstone that continues to provoke discussion, analysis, and reflection. Part 7 explores how Manson's image, story, and legacy have persisted in the media, in popular culture, and in society's ongoing attempts to understand the intersection of crime, psychology, and human behavior. Manson's presence in cultural discourse is multifaceted. On one hand, he is remembered as a criminal mastermind, responsible for orchestrating one of the most infamous murder sprees in American history. On the other hand, he has been interpreted as a cautionary symbol of manipulation, charisma, and the dangers inherent in social isolation and disenfranchisement. This duality has made Manson a compelling subject for filmmakers, authors, musicians, and scholars, each attempting to capture the complexity of a man whose personality, ideology, and influence defied simple categorization. In film and television, Manson has been portrayed both directly and indirectly, often serving as a symbol of societal fear, moral corruption, or cultural upheaval. Movies like Helter Skelter, 1976, and documentaries such as Manson, 1973, or Charles Manson, The Final Words, 2017, have chronicled his life and crimes, emphasizing the psychological manipulation that allowed him to control his followers. Each portrayal reflects the era in which it was produced, revealing shifts in public perception, from horror and moral outrage to fascination with the psychological and sociological aspects of his influence. These films and documentaries have cemented Manson's place not only in true crime history but also in the broader cultural imagination, ensuring that his story remains relevant to new generations. Manson's influence has also been evident in music. Before the murders, he attempted to establish a career as a musician in Los Angeles, forming connections with prominent figures such as Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys. Songs he wrote or performed have been covered or recorded by other artists, and his association with music has contributed to the mythos surrounding him. While some musicians have used Manson's story as a source of artistic exploration, others have done so provocatively, blurring the lines between condemnation, fascination, and sensationalism. This enduring musical connection reinforces the tension between culture and crime, highlighting society's complex relationship with notoriety and transgression. The media has played a critical role in shaping Manson's posthumous reputation. Newspapers, magazines, and online platforms have continued to analyze his crimes, ideology, and psychological profile, often framing him as a case study in manipulation, cult leadership, and human cruelty. True crime podcasts, YouTube documentaries, and social media discussions have introduced Manson to new audiences, sometimes reigniting debates about morality, fame, and the ethical responsibilities of media coverage. Analysts frequently note that media fascination can inadvertently romanticize or mythologize criminals, turning them into symbols rather than human beings. Manson's case exemplifies this tension. He is both a real-life perpetrator of horrific violence and a cultural icon whose story has been repeatedly retold, adapted, and analyzed. Academics and psychologists have extensively studied Manson to understand the mechanisms of manipulation, obedience, and group psychology. His ability to exert control over his followers, convincing them to commit murder, has been examined in the context of coercive persuasion, charismatic authority, and psychological vulnerability. Scholars emphasize that understanding Manson is not about excusing his actions but about learning how social, environmental, and psychological factors can converge to produce extreme behavior. This perspective has informed studies on cults, radicalization, and criminal psychology, offering insights that extend beyond Manson himself to broader questions about human behavior. Manson's story also continues to provoke debate about morality, evil, and the nature of criminal responsibility. While some view him purely as an evil figure whose actions demand condemnation, others examine the social and psychological factors that contributed to his rise. His early life, marked by abuse, neglect, and repeated encounters with the criminal justice system, provides context but not justification for his actions. Discussions about Manson challenge society to reconcile individual responsibility with systemic failure, prompting reflection on how neglect, trauma, and cultural conditions can influence human behavior. One of the most striking aspects of Manson's legacy is his ongoing influence on the public imagination. He has become a symbol of the darker side of the 1960s counterculture, a warning about the seductive power of ideology, and a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked charisma. His name evokes fear, fascination, and intrigue, demonstrating how historical figures can transcend their immediate actions to become cultural touchstones. This influence is evident in the persistent references to Manson in literature, film, music, and popular discourse, each new reference reintroducing his story to audiences and ensuring that his legacy remains alive. Manson's notoriety has also sparked discussions about the ethical responsibilities of society in representing crime. Critics argue that sensationalized portrayals risk glorifying perpetrators while overshadowing the experiences of victims. Advocates for responsible media coverage emphasize the importance of balancing the examination of criminal psychology with acknowledgement of the human cost of violence. In Manson's case, this has led to a proliferation of works that focus on the victims, the psychological mechanisms of manipulation, and the broader cultural context of the crimes. By centering these perspectives, society can study Manson's story without reducing it to mere spectacle. His influence on subcultures is another notable aspect of his legacy. Manson has been referenced in music, fashion, and art, often as a provocative symbol of rebellion, countercultural critique, or moral transgression. These references are not endorsements of his actions but reflections of his role as a cultural icon representing the intersection of charisma, manipulation, and violence. Subcultural engagement with Manson's image demonstrates how society grapples with the tension between fascination and condemnation, illustrating the complexities of human curiosity about criminality and transgression. Despite his death in 2017, Manson continues to be a figure of study and reflection. Documentaries, academic papers, and popular media keep his story alive, exploring both the specifics of his crimes and the broader lessons they offer. Psychologists analyze his manipulation techniques, criminologists examine his influence on followers, and cultural critics explore his enduring mythos. Manson's life and actions serve as a reminder that evil can manifest in unexpected ways, that charisma can be weaponized, and that society must remain vigilant against the forces of manipulation and coercion. Manson's legacy is also intertwined with legal and criminological history. His trial and conviction highlighted the application of conspiracy laws, the prosecution of cult-related crimes, and the ethical considerations of media coverage in high-profile cases. Legal scholars continue to examine the Manson case as a benchmark for understanding criminal responsibility, group influence, and the role of ideology in motivating violence. These discussions contribute to a broader understanding of the justice system, illustrating both its successes and limitations in addressing complex criminal phenomena. Moreover, Manson's life and crimes provoke reflection on the vulnerabilities of youth and society. His ability to attract and control a group of young followers demonstrates how isolation, emotional need, and social marginalization can make individuals susceptible to coercion. This has led to ongoing research on prevention strategies, intervention programs, and educational efforts designed to reduce susceptibility to manipulative figures. In this sense, Manson's story is not only a historical account but also a guide for understanding and preventing future instances of similar criminal influence. The fascination with Manson also reflects broader societal anxieties. His crimes occurred at a time of cultural upheaval, political tension, and generational conflict. The murders and the ensuing media coverage highlighted fears about the breakdown of social norms, the dangers of radical ideology, and the potential for charismatic individuals to exploit vulnerabilities. Today, these anxieties persist, and Manson's story serves as a lens through which society examines ongoing concerns about manipulation, radicalization, and the consequences of ignoring warning signs in social and cultural contexts. In examining Charles Manson's posthumous influence, it becomes clear that the story of Charles Manson is not just about one man's descent into crime. It is a lens through which society can examine the psychology of cults, manipulation, and human vulnerability. Manson's ability to command loyalty, manipulate perception, and orchestrate horrific acts underscores the powerful interplay between charisma, ideology, and psychological influence. Part 8 delves into the mechanisms of control Manson employed, the nature of cult behavior, and the broader societal implications of understanding such dynamics. Manson's family was not merely a group of followers. It was a microcosm of social and psychological vulnerability. Individuals were drawn to him for a variety of reasons: emotional instability, a search for belonging, or the desire to escape conventional societal constraints. Manson capitalized on these vulnerabilities, offering a combination of acceptance, purpose, and radical ideology. His charisma was not simply personal charm but a carefully constructed tool, reinforced by his ability to manipulate emotions, instill fear, and present himself as both a spiritual guide and a revolutionary figure. Central to Manson's influence was his ability to exploit the psychological concept of dependency. Followers were encouraged to reject external authorities, including family, society, and traditional moral frameworks. In this insulated environment, Manson became the ultimate authority, controlling information, shaping beliefs, and dictating behavior. This form of psychological dependency is common in high-control groups or cults, where the leader consolidates power by isolating members from alternative perspectives. Manson's family was a textbook example of this dynamic. The members' entire social, emotional, and ideological universe revolved around him. Manson's teachings were a blend of apocalyptic prophecy, distorted religious ideology, and countercultural rhetoric. He preached an impending racial war, which he called Helter Skelter, framing his vision as both inevitable and necessary. By presenting a world in chaos, he created a sense of urgency and existential purpose for his followers. This manipulation of fear is a hallmark of cult leadership, when individuals perceive that survival or moral relevance depends on absolute adherence to a leader. Rational judgment is overridden by emotional dependency. Manson's ability to intertwine ideology with personal authority made it nearly impossible for his followers to question him without feeling existentially threatened. The mechanisms Manson employed are supported by research on social influence and group psychology. Techniques such as love bombing, isolation, and emotional reinforcement are common in manipulative groups. Initially, followers are overwhelmed with attention and affection, creating a sense of unconditional acceptance. This is gradually paired with fear, guilt, and the denigration of external authority, which reinforces dependency. Manson's family experienced these tactics consistently. Newcomers were seduced by attention and novelty, then gradually conditioned to adopt his worldview, and ultimately coerced into acts that aligned with his apocalyptic vision. Manson also exploited the dynamics of identity and self-concept. Followers often experience personal instability or dissatisfaction, making them receptive to a new identity prescribed by Manson. In a sense, joining the family offered not only belonging but a redefinition of self. Members were encouraged to abandon former identities, embrace new names, and adopt behaviors that reinforced collective loyalty. This process of identity transformation is psychologically potent. It deepens commitment and makes dissent psychologically painful. Manson's ability to shape identity was critical to his control, turning abstract ideology into concrete behavioral compliance. Another element of Manson's manipulation was the use of drugs, music, and ritualized experiences to induce altered states of consciousness. Psychedelic drugs, combined with repetitive teachings and emotionally charged experiences, created conditions in which critical thinking was diminished and suggestion was amplified. Rituals, whether violent, sexual, or symbolic, reinforced group cohesion and the leader's authority. The psychological impact of these practices should not be underestimated. They created a feedback loop in which loyalty, fear, and ideological commitment were mutually reinforcing. Manson's control over his followers also demonstrates the role of emotional contagion in group behavior. Strong emotions, whether fear, excitement, or fervor, spread rapidly within groups, influencing perception and decision-making. By maintaining a high-intensity emotional environment, Manson ensured that rational evaluation was replaced by collective momentum. This phenomenon is common in high-control groups and cults, where the emotional climate is orchestrated to reinforce obedience. The Manson family exemplified this dynamic. Members acted not solely from individual conviction but as part of an emotionally charged collective that magnified Manson's influence. The consequences of such manipulation are profound. Individuals in Manson's orbit committed acts they might never have contemplated outside the context of his control. Psychological studies of coercion and obedience, such as Stanley Milgram's experiments, show that ordinary individuals can be led to commit harmful acts under authority. Manson's case is a real-world demonstration of these principles, illustrating how the convergence of isolation, dependency, and ideological manipulation can produce extreme behavior. Manson's story also illuminates the societal factors that facilitate cult formation. He thrived in a specific historical context, the late 1960s, a period marked by cultural upheaval, youth rebellion, and widespread experimentation with alternative lifestyles. Social dislocation, distrust of traditional institutions, and the allure of countercultural communities provided fertile ground for Manson's influence. While his tactics were personal and psychological, they were amplified by broader societal conditions that made young people more receptive to radical ideology and charismatic leadership. Beyond understanding Manson himself, the study of cult dynamics has implications for modern society. Contemporary cases of extremist groups, manipulative religious organizations, and radical political movements often exhibit patterns similar to Manson's. Isolation, indoctrination, emotional reinforcement, and identity transformation remain core tools of influence. By studying historical examples like Manson, psychologists, law enforcement, and social scientists gain insights into prevention, intervention, and the identification of vulnerable individuals. The lessons extend beyond historical curiosity. They are practical tools for understanding ongoing challenges in social control and radicalization. Victim awareness and education are also essential components of societal response. Many of Manson's followers were young women who, like millions of other individuals, sought belonging and purpose. By understanding how Manson manipulated emotion, fear, and ideology, society can better equip individuals to recognize warning signs, resist coercion, and make informed decisions. Awareness campaigns, mental health interventions, and educational programs targeting social influence and critical thinking are all informed by the study of cases like Manson's. Manson's story also serves as a cautionary tale about media and public fascination with crime. His notoriety has been amplified by sensationalized coverage, documentaries, and cultural references. While studying his behavior is important for psychological and sociological reasons, it is equally important to contextualize his story ethically, emphasizing victims and societal lessons rather than glorifying the perpetrator. This balance is crucial. Fascination must not overshadow the human cost of crime or distort understanding of the mechanisms of manipulation. The psychological framework evident in Manson's control, dependency, identity transformation, emotional manipulation, is mirrored in many other high-control groups. From religious cults to extremist organizations, the principles remain consistent: isolation from outside influence, creation of emotional intensity, establishment of absolute authority, and imposition of ideology that aligns individual behavior with group objectives. Manson's case provides a stark illustration of these principles, offering a detailed study of how personality, environment, and social dynamics converge to produce extreme outcomes. The lessons of Manson's influence also extend to broader discussions of morality and human responsibility. While his followers were coerced and manipulated, society debates the extent of their culpability. The tension between individual agency and environmental influence is a central theme in criminology and psychology. By examining these dynamics, scholars and practitioners gain insight into how human behavior can be shaped, redirected, or exploited, insights that are essential for both prevention and rehabilitation. Manson's enduring legacy lies in the duality of fascination and caution. The story of Charles Manson is not only a tale of manipulation, cult dynamics, and psychological influence, it is also a landmark in American legal history. The trials that followed the 1969 murders committed by Manson and his followers captivated the nation and fundamentally altered the public's perception of crime, justice, and societal responsibility. Part 9 examines the legal aftermath of Manson's crimes, the unprecedented nature of his trial, and the enduring societal lessons derived from the judicial process. The Manson family's crimes reached their peak infamy with the brutal murders of actress Sharon Tate and 4 others at her Los Angeles home on August 9, 1969. The following night, Manson's followers murdered Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. These acts were intended to ignite the apocalyptic, helter-skelter, racial war Manson had prophesied. While Manson himself did not physically commit the murders, his orchestration of the events and ideological manipulation made him legally and morally accountable. The law would soon confront a profound question: to what extent could an individual be held responsible for crimes committed by others under their influence? Manson's arrest came after a period of investigation that involved complex forensic work and interrogation of the family members themselves. Initially, law enforcement faced difficulty connecting Manson directly to the murders. However, confessions from his followers, coupled with mounting evidence of planning, ideology, and directive authority, established Manson as the mastermind. This approach to legal accountability, holding a leader responsible for orchestrating crimes without direct physical involvement, set a precedent in criminal law and illustrated the challenge of prosecuting manipulation and conspiracy. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers, which began in June 1970, was extraordinary in scope, media attention, and courtroom theatrics. The prosecution faced the task of demonstrating not only the factual basis of the murders but also the psychological control Manson exerted over his followers. The courtroom became a stage on which the dynamics of cult influence were publicly displayed. Manson's erratic behavior, followers' loyalty, and the chilling recitations of his ideology captured national attention. The trial blurred the line between legal procedure and societal spectacle, emphasizing the interplay between justice, psychology, and media. Manson's legal defense faced a unique challenge. He represented the embodiment of ideological manipulation, making traditional defense strategies less effective. The prosecution emphasized Manson's role as a leader who orchestrated violence, relying on witness testimony and evidence of premeditation. The trial also delved into Manson's writings, recorded conversations, and public statements, which revealed both intent and strategy. By establishing a clear connection between Manson's ideology and the actions of his followers, the prosecution demonstrated the concept of vicarious liability, the idea that one could be held accountable for crimes committed under their direction. One of the most striking aspects of the trial was Manson's courtroom behavior. He frequently disrupted proceedings, chanted, and attempted to provoke reactions from both the judge and the jury. Observers noted that his erratic conduct was not simply eccentricity, it was a continuation of his manipulative tactics. Even in a controlled legal environment, Manson maintained influence over perceptions and created an atmosphere of fear and unpredictability. His behavior challenged conventional courtroom norms and underscored the difficulty of managing cases involving highly charismatic yet criminally manipulative figures. The media played a critical role in shaping public perception of the trial. Newspapers, television, and emerging documentaries broadcast Manson's image to the nation, often emphasizing sensational aspects rather than legal nuance. This coverage heightened the sense of moral panic, creating a cultural narrative in which Manson became the embodiment of evil, countercultural excess, and societal vulnerability. The media frenzy also complicated the judicial process, raising questions about the impact of public opinion on jury impartiality, legal strategy, and broader societal discourse. The verdict, handed down in March 1971, found Manson and several of his followers guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Initially sentenced to death, Manson's sentence, along with those of other family members, was commuted to life imprisonment after the California Supreme Court invalidated the state's death penalty statutes in 1972. While the legal system succeeded in securing convictions, the trial highlighted the limitations of traditional criminal law in addressing crimes rooted in psychological manipulation, coercion, and ideological control. The court had to grapple with questions of agency, obedience, and moral responsibility in unprecedented ways. The Manson trial also led to a broader societal reckoning. It prompted discussions about the vulnerability of youth, the influence of charismatic leaders, and the cultural factors that facilitated such crimes. Psychologists, sociologists, and criminologists examined the case to understand the dynamics of cults, groupthink, and obedience. The trial became a catalyst for research into coercive influence, ultimately contributing to better understanding and prevention of similar phenomena. Beyond academia, the case influenced public policy, law enforcement training, and community awareness campaigns aimed at identifying and intervening in manipulative or high-control groups. One significant legal and societal implication of the Manson case was the consideration of psychological manipulation in criminal responsibility. While the law ultimately held Manson and his followers accountable, the trial highlighted the gray area between personal culpability and coerced participation. Members of the family were often young, impressionable, and emotionally vulnerable, raising ethical and legal questions about intent, free will, and moral responsibility. Courts, scholars, and practitioners have since used the Manson case as a benchmark for understanding how influence, ideology, and coercion intersect with criminal law. The trial also exposed tensions between individual liberty and state responsibility. The Manson case illustrated how society must balance the protection of individual rights with the need to prevent manipulation, coercion, and violence. It spurred debates about parental responsibility, youth vulnerability, and the role of the state in safeguarding citizens from psychological harm. These discussions remain relevant today, as modern societies grapple with the influence of extremist groups, online radicalization, and manipulative networks that exploit human vulnerability in both digital and physical spaces. Beyond the courtroom, Manson's incarceration became a symbol of the intersection of criminal justice and cultural myth-making. Even in prison, he maintained a presence in the public imagination, with interviews, media coverage, and cultural references keeping his story alive. His continued notoriety has generated ongoing ethical debate, the tension between educating society about the dangers of manipulation and inadvertently glamorizing criminal behavior. Scholars emphasize that careful framing is essential, ensuring that the focus remains on victims, societal lessons, and prevention rather than sensationalism. Manson's legal legacy extends to the study of conspiracy and collective liability. His trial demonstrated that leaders could be held responsible for crimes committed under their direction, establishing precedent for prosecuting organized crime, extremist groups, and manipulative networks. The case underscored the importance of investigating leadership, intent, and ideological influence when assessing criminal behavior. Courts, law enforcement agencies, and policymakers have since referenced the Manson case when evaluating complex criminal networks, demonstrating its lasting impact on legal strategy and jurisprudence. The societal response to Manson also included a reevaluation of law enforcement and mental health practices. Authorities recognized the importance of early intervention in cases involving manipulative leaders and vulnerable individuals. Mental health professionals began to study coercive influence more systematically, contributing to the development of programs designed to prevent radicalization, assist victims, and rehabilitate former cult members. The Manson case highlighted that crime prevention is not only about physical security but also about understanding psychological, social, and cultural dynamics that enable manipulation. Victims' advocacy emerged as another critical aspect of the post-trial landscape. Families of those murdered by the Manson family demanded recognition, restitution, and societal attention to the human cost of criminal manipulation. The case demonstrated that criminal trials must address not only perpetrator accountability, but also the needs and dignity of victims. This perspective has influenced subsequent legal practices, from sentencing to public communication, ensuring that victims remain central in discussions of justice and societal responsibility. The Manson trial also sparked cultural introspection. America, in the early 19th, Charles Manson's story did not end with the courtroom. After his convictions and sentencing to life imprisonment, Manson became a symbol of evil, manipulation, and the darker aspects of the 1960s counterculture. Part 10 examines Manson's later years in prison, the evolution of public perception, his attempts at influence from behind bars, and the enduring cultural fascination with his persona. This final chapter in Manson's life underscores how his actions and ideology left a lasting imprint on American culture, criminal justice, and societal consciousness. Even in prison, Manson maintained a complex presence. His early years of incarceration were marked by continued attempts to exert influence over followers and the media. Letters, interviews, and visits from admirers allowed him to remain a figure of notoriety. Manson's ability to cultivate attention, even from behind bars, demonstrated the persistent power of charisma combined with ideological extremism. Despite being physically confined, he continued to manipulate perceptions and provoke reactions, reinforcing the lesson that influence is not solely dependent on physical freedom but also on psychological control. Manson's life in prison also highlighted the interplay between punishment, rehabilitation, and societal fascination. While the justice system ensured he could not directly harm others, his presence became a cultural phenomenon, sparking discussions about the limits of incarceration and the ethical challenges of managing high-profile criminals. Prison officials, psychologists, and sociologists monitored Manson not only for safety but also as a case study in coercion, personality disorder, and enduring criminal influence. His existence in prison became a living illustration of the long-term consequences of unchecked manipulation and violence. Over the decades, Manson's public persona evolved. He was frequently interviewed, sometimes for documentaries, sometimes for sensationalist media coverage. In these appearances, Manson continued to oscillate between appearing incoherent, philosophical, and threatening. He used media attention to perpetuate his notoriety, carefully curating his image as both a criminal mastermind and a cultural enigma. Scholars note that Manson's media engagement reflected a deep understanding of modern celebrity culture. By staying visible, he ensured that his narrative continued to influence public discourse long after the original crimes. Psychological analyses of Manson intensified during his incarceration. Researchers studied his writings, statements, and behavior to understand the mechanisms of influence, charisma, and authoritarian control. Manson's ability to manipulate followers, particularly vulnerable young women, became a central focus of studies on cults, coercive persuasion, and psychological dependency. These investigations contributed to broader societal understanding of how individuals can be swayed by ideology, emotion, and social pressure, informing both criminal justice and mental health practices. Despite his notoriety, Manson's ability to gain new followers diminished over time. The infamy of the Tate LaBianca murders, combined with his incarceration, created a barrier to direct recruitment. However, letters from admirers, occasional visits, and media interactions allowed him to retain a limited but persistent influence. Manson became less of a direct threat to society but more of a symbolic figure, representing extremism, manipulation, and the dangers of unchecked ideology. This shift emphasized the dual nature of criminal legacy. Immediate harm may end, but cultural and symbolic impact can persist for decades. Manson's later years were also marked by reflection and sometimes public confrontation with his own legacy. While he never expressed genuine remorse in a conventional sense, he engaged with questions about morality, justice, and societal reaction. These interactions, whether through media or occasional statements, highlighted the enduring tension between criminal accountability and personal ideology. Manson's ability to provoke thought, even in disturbing ways, illustrated the complexity of his persona, a mixture of criminality, charisma, and philosophical extremism. The societal fascination with Manson did not diminish after his sentencing. Books, documentaries, films, and academic studies explored his life, crimes, and ideology. Manson became an archetype for discussions about evil, cult dynamics, and the darker side of charisma. His image appeared in popular culture not just as a criminal but as a cautionary symbol of what happens when manipulation, ideology, and charisma intersect with vulnerability and social upheaval. Scholars argue that this cultural obsession is rooted in both horror and fascination, the human desire to understand the incomprehensible, to study the limits of morality, and to confront societal fears. Manson's influence also prompted ethical debates in media and academia. Coverage of his life and crimes risked glorifying him or sensationalizing violence. Writers, filmmakers, and scholars faced the challenge of balancing informative discussion with responsible representation. The debate extended to social media and digital culture, where Manson's image and quotations occasionally circulated, raising questions about how society engages with historical criminals and the potential for inadvertent idolization. These discussions underscored the continuing relevance of ethical considerations when presenting notorious figures. Prison life provided Manson with a platform to continue ideological dissemination in subtle ways. Through letters and conversations with journalists, he occasionally espoused philosophical or apocalyptic ideas, some linked to his helter-skelter narrative. While largely symbolic, these communications demonstrated that ideology can persist even without direct access to followers. Experts in criminology and psychology note that Manson's post-incarceration influence serves as a case study in the durability of radical ideology, especially when combined with personal charisma and a carefully managed public image. Manson's death in November 2017 marked the end of a life steeped in crime, manipulation, and cultural infamy. Yet even after his death, his presence remained potent in the public imagination. Retrospectives, media analyses, and scholarly examinations proliferated, reflecting society's ongoing need to understand his influence and its implications. His life, crimes, and cultural impact continue to be studied as part of a broader exploration of criminal psychology, societal vulnerability, and the consequences of ideology run amok. The enduring fascination with Manson can also be attributed to the broader social and historical context in which he operated. The late 1960s were a time of cultural upheaval, youth rebellion, and questioning of traditional authority. Manson exploited these conditions, tapping into both idealism and disillusionment. By examining Manson's life, society gains insight not only into the mechanisms of manipulation but also into the vulnerabilities inherent in periods of social change. His story serves as a reminder that cultural shifts can create openings for those seeking to exploit uncertainty and emotion for nefarious purposes. Manson's legacy also persists in legal and academic spheres. His trial set precedent for understanding leadership culpability in crimes committed by followers. The study of cults, coercive persuasion, and extreme ideology often references Manson as a foundational case. Law enforcement agencies, mental health professionals, and educators continue to analyze the Manson family as an example of how ideology, charisma, and psychological control intersect with criminal behavior. His case remains a touchstone for discussions on prevention, intervention, and societal resilience against manipulation. Culturally, Manson has been both vilified and mythologized. He embodies a convergence of fear, fascination, and moral curiosity. His life invites reflection on questions of evil, morality, and human vulnerability. By studying his persona, society grapples with the limits of control, the consequences of unchecked ideology, and the need for vigilance against manipulation in all forms. While Manson himself caused immense harm, the broader discourse his life inspired has contributed to knowledge, awareness, and strategies for preventing similar tragedies. Manson's story also serves as a cautionary tale for the digital age. The mechanisms of influence he employed, charisma, emotional manipulation, ideological framing, are amplified in online communities. Radicalization, recruitment, and extremist movements now occur across digital networks, making the lessons of Manson's life relevant for modern society. Understanding the psychological and social dynamics that enabled his influence can inform education, policy, and prevention strategies aimed at reducing susceptibility to manipulation in contemporary contexts. In conclusion, Charles Manson's later years in prison, his ongoing influence, and his enduring cultural legacy illustrate the complex intersection of crime, psychology, and society. His life demonstrates the capacity for one individual to cause profound harm while also shaping discourse on morality.